If you are joining us for our continued series on the 2024 Swanepoel Trends Report, you're showing up in the right place. I see people coming right into the room. This is a well-trained group. I was just talking to Chris Riley earlier. We had a lot of people sign up for this series, and we're just, every week we've been doing this. So this week we have a very exciting talk that we're going to give you on the chapter on artificial intelligence. And so if you were part of the series, welcome. I'm going to give people another, 30 seconds or so to get spooled into the Zoom. So I see some familiar names and people coming in. So great to see everybody coming back in. Yeah. Hey, Brandon, you're here. Great to see you. You've done some great stuff lately. Carla Brown, also great to see you joining us. David Price, welcome. You guys have made a big announcement this week, didn't you? I think you had Cameron Payne join you guys. So that's fantastic. Yeah, get a little group, good coming in. It looks like we've hit about where I was expected to. So we'll go ahead and get this kicked off. So my name is Jack Miller, the president and CEO of T360. Welcome to the latest in our series on this 2024 Swanepoel Trends Report. I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Kurt Bollacker. So Dr. Bollacker joins us. He's also here in Austin, Texas, coincidentally. Another fun fact about Kurt is that he and I have known each other since 1992, so we go way back. And when we had a chapter come up about artificial intelligence that we want to do, he was one of the principal people we consulted on it, and he contributed some really great thinking and content to that. So welcome, Kurt. We're delighted to have you here today.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So before we get started, why don't we talk a little bit about the report, and then I'll ask you to do a little introduction so people know who you are. So this is, for those of you joining us, our purpose in these webinars is to cover the Swanepoel Trends Report, to look at all the main chapters in the report and give you guys sort of a high-level update on it. This week we are covering Trend 6, which is the promise and limitations of generative AI, and Kurt's going to help us kind of muddy our way through that and figure out what we need to know and learn. Let's start first with Kurt. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in artificial intelligence? I feel like every third or fourth person in technology I'm talking to nowadays is claiming, a lot of knowledge about artificial intelligence, and so it's challenging. And it seems like every tech company in our industry is saying, "Oh, we're now an AI company, and we now do all this stuff." So talk to us a little bit about your background in artificial intelligence and kind of your perspective on it from your professional work and how long you've been attached to that industry.
Okay, thanks. So I actually got my PhD at UT Austin in machine learning and AI in the 90s, which is amusingly at a time when there were no jobs at all at all. It was purely an academic endeavor. So finished my dissertation, did a bunch of, interesting research, and then left. And I went and I worked on search engines. I built a search engine called Sightseer for computer science literature. And then I moved into the area of archiving. I was technical director of the Internet Archive and made the first prototype of the Wayback Machine, for folks who know that. And then I built a multilingual archive, an archive with a translation archive with 1,500 languages. And then worked on graph databases, which means large semantic graph databases, and helped start a company that built a graph database called Freebase that was bought by Google. And now if you go to Google and you see those little Wikipedia boxes that when you search for a person or a place, that is the technology that powers that. So really, my background ended up not being about AI. It was about data and large public data sets that were of value. And AI was completely different. It was just a bunch of math. But then sometime about 10 years ago, there was a transition, partly driven by the big tech companies, in particular Google, of learning to train AI systems with a lot of data and a lot of compute power, like 1,000,000 times what had been there a decade before. And so that ramp up into, having all of AI be very, very data heavy which allows it to learn systems to not just be simple single purpose narrowly focused systems. Then that was a big shift. So about a year ago, I was like, you know what, it's starting to get interesting again with slow progress. But then ChatGPT and the other chatbots hit, and I'm like, wow, okay, now it's interesting again. So I jumped back in and caught up on 20 years of math, and then started playing in this space. And now I work for a nonprofit called ML Commons, where I'm helping lead an effort to build a suite of public AI safety tests.
Yeah, which that's a big topic right now, is that, and we've even had people in our industry say, how do we, how do we know that the AIs are safe to use, and how do we know that they're not, creating things that they shouldn't be creating or violating things like fair housing law? So I think you're doing, and I've had a lot of conversations about that work, that's very valuable, valuable work that needs to be done in order to, to make the world a little bit safer with a new technology coming to market. So let's talk a little bit about the growth of AI. I pulled a few slides from our chapter that I thought I would share. We could have a little conversation about. So this was part of why we decided to write about this trend, is just the 10 years to an overnight success. So as Kurt described, we spent 10 years ago, some new work started happening with these large data sets, and then ChatGPT comes out and then just takes off. So Kurt, talk to us about kind of your perspective on the proliferation of tools. It feels like there's something new coming out almost every day.
Okay, so for decades, what would end up happening is there'd be engineering advancement, there'd be mathematics advancement, and scientific advancement. But then that was the thing that happened 10 years ago. Suddenly there's a lot of data, and suddenly there's a lot of compute available. And that's not science or math, or engineering. Well, it is some engineering, but the point was that scale up suddenly started, there was a shift in dynamics. So these systems that could do things were very, very predictable, very, very simple. And now suddenly they got so big and so complex, people didn't understand them. They not only could they not understand what was going on, they couldn't predict what these systems would do, but they were doing things that were surprisingly useful. And so some of this, you think early days, you remember back in the mid-teens, there was a lot of people generating the early image generators. They were kind of very abstract and artistic, but not very particularly realistic. And but you started, say, generating realistic looking faces. That was about, like 2015, 2016. And it's like, wow, this is amazing. I don't know what to do with it. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but it is, literally, awe-inspiring. And so all of this came to a head about, a year and a half, 2 years ago, when the chatbots started appearing, and we had, ones released made by Microsoft and Google, and they released them, and they realized, wow, these things have a lot of problems, and they drew them back. But they also are big companies with a lot of liability. Then OpenAI, which is a startup and no liability, did the same thing. They were a little behind, but they finally released something, and it was pretty good, and they just launched. And they did it with a little less caution. And so it caught on, and then the big tech companies had to start, catching up. And then that's when, it was exposed to everyone, and all of the mess and all of the good things and all the bad things suddenly are available. And in this graph, you'll see, this was like late 2022 is when it got released. And then suddenly it just went nuts until, by middle of last year, it's just like everybody in the world's using it. And the paradigm has shifted, the whole world has changed, and now we're stuck with it. But as if any of you know, there's Chris, if you want to put in the Wikipedia article for the hype cycle of technology, you can see that this thing is kind of tracking the first part of like the
normal hype cycle.
Peak is the peak of that. And so we're it's coming back down, and we're starting to see, all right, maybe we're starting to head a little bit down, and we're going to hit that trough of disillusionment when everybody's seeing it does all this cool stuff. Now you're worried that it's going to screw things up, and that it's going to say false things or damaging things, and then people are a little bit more cautious about it. So that's probably why you see the downtrend. But this is, it's a normal hype cycle. It's just the only thing that's different here is that we have this amazing graph of ChatGPT visits to almost literally track it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think for me, part of me tracking the hype cycle is how many people are all of a sudden experts on it and now teaching classes on prompt engineering and all this kind of stuff. So it's very, very humorous to watch that. Same thing happened with social media. You know, we've seen this a number of different times where all of a sudden we have a whole proliferation of expertise. Let's talk a little bit about, these are some of the common tools, and talk to us a little bit about the different, these are three obvious ones that I think fit, are kind of general purpose, used in a lot of different ways. I've got some industry color for these, but talk to us about these different tools and your perspective on them.
Okay, so one thing I'll do a tiny bit of background on what generative AI is versus previous generative AI. So AI systems, they're mostly used as predictors. You give it a bunch of examples of something, and you give it a bunch of examples of a banana and a car, and you show it a bunch of photos of each of these things, and then you show it a new image of a banana or a car, and it makes a guess which one is it. And that's great, but you might end up showing it a picture of a palm tree, which is neither a banana nor a car, but it only knows bananas and cars. So it'll choose banana or car, and it will be wrong. But it doesn't know it's wrong, and it doesn't know how much it's wrong. So that's
you just described my 15-year-old, by the way.
So generative AI is different in that instead of like predicting one from a set of classes or choices, what it's trying to do is predict the next thing. Let's take chatbots, for example. So chatbots work where, hey, I've got all these words in a row, and if I were going to predict the next word, then what would that word be? And then it predicts it. And then you say, well, let's add that onto the list. Now what's the next word after that? And so on and so on and so on. And that's how these things work. There's a lot of thought put into it. There's a lot of tuning, but it's nothing more complex than that. So this is why very, very short things tend to be a little more reliable. Very long things can start meandering and going off the rails. And so that's how these things work. Image generators, video generators do a little something different. What they try to do is you train it on a bunch of images or video frames, and then what you do is you give it's trained to remove the noise. And so what happens is in the context of also an input of text, it says, hey, if this is my description, remove the noise from it. And so it literally iteratively takes an image of just white noise, like static on a television, and iteratively tries to remove the noise, which it's starting from nothing. So it ends up like converging on something that ends up being an amalgam, a combination of the images or the video that it has seen in the past. So it's just recombining the things that it has seen. Interestingly, it's very hard to determine whether something that's been generated by a chatbot is machine generated or not, because it's often borrowing from real people's words. However, the nature of image and video generators, meaning there's now research that shows that you can mathematically detect the fact that images and video are generated instead of being real. So that's much, much easier than with text. But that said, you now have these tools that are generated, so you can like type things in, and what it's trying to do is complete that prediction. And so you can do that over and over, and with the right questions and the right prompting, it will generate almost anything. Whether it's right or useful is a different question.
Yeah, yeah. And we've run into, we use chatbots at T360 as a research tool. So we'll ask it to go summarize articles and bring things to us. But I've told our whole team, and I've spoken in front of an audience that said, you have a college intern. And so you need to treat the chatbot as a college intern. You would not rely on the work of the college intern. You would take the work and you critique it and say, this is pretty good. This doesn't line up with some things that I know. So I'm going to have it, I'm going to go plug into the sources myself and find out. Because like you said, Kurt, it doesn't know whether it's right or wrong. It's just literally putting words together that makes sense based on all of the examples that it's been able to find that are relevant, is the point.
Yep. So in terms of using these things, there's three categories that I think are really safe to use them for, like in almost all cases. The first is entertaining fiction. If you want it to generate something that's is false, and you want it for your own amusements or your child's amusement, do it. It's great for that. The second is if you need a brainstorming helper, you're writing an article or you're trying to build a diagram and you just want some inspiration. That's not too far from the entertaining fiction use case, but it basically means that you can get this and it can make you think of things. And if you're not using it directly, you're just saying, I should think in this space, and that can accelerate what you're doing. The third thing that these things can do is they can be a little bit of a secretary, a little bit of an administrative helper. Meaning if you ask ChatGPT for all of the names of the United States in reverse alphabetical order, it'll probably get that right. And it's easy to count. There's 50. Okay, we know it probably didn't miss any. Right. However, if you were to say, that did a really simple thing. However, if you start asking it for deeper factual information, like all the 50 states with their current population, well, then suddenly you're asking for a lot of factual information, and then you maybe have stepped over the line and you need to go fact check.
Yeah. And by the way, your descriptions of how to use it, we have used it to draft preliminary agendas for meetings. We've used it to write preliminary drafts of if everybody here knows that we produce this wonderful Power 200 list, we rank all 200 leaders. Well, most of those bios, the initial draft of the bios of the top 200 leaders were written by artificial intelligence that we then fact checked and rewrote or changed, but it was great as a starter. And so your description of using it as a brainstorming tool or getting something on paper tool to begin with, I think is very, very useful and has, I know it saved our organization a lot of time. Similarly, the warning you give about factual information, we used to do some research around agency law and trying to document the different kinds of agency law throughout the United States. And it was useful for finding the resources, but it was not useful for actually saying whether or not you could do a certain kind of agency in a given state. It struggled to get that accurate because a lot of the agency law is complex and requires interpretation or depends on multiple facts. So I think those are good warnings for people, but also some appropriate uses. I did want to comment on the image generation and video generators appear to have really high utility in our space because of how visual our industry is, and things like taking photos, enhancing them, or doing virtual furniture. And we've had applications and software that has been doing that for a while. So it seems like that's a really useful space for real estate. Similarly, being able to create customized video for customers or property descriptions or all kinds of things like that seems to have really found a home in the real estate industry. There are a number of companies that are doing this now. One of the areas that we're seeing innovation, I'm interested in your take on this, Kurt, is customer service. There's some companies that are doing responsive AIs where you can, they'll actually run a phone call, they'll set an appointment, or they'll reach out and check in and find out if somebody needs to maybe talk to a real estate professional, if they're ready to sell their home, things like that. Do you have any opinions about that kind of technology?
So it's interesting is that I'll go off on an area. Since the time the report came out, there's been a lot of advance in an area that they'll call it retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. That's the back end buzzword. You might not ever see that in the product or even in a non-technical document. But what it essentially is it's a current collection of techniques, and there's a lot of startups and some big tech companies that are getting into it, to use generative AI as an assistant to what would essentially be search engines. So you have corpus of documents, and you want to be able to essentially ask questions about those documents. And the way that essentially works is they take all of your documents. There are some efforts to put it on the whole internet. Those are not as high quality, but at an enterprise level, there can be an organization such as one that's providing that customer service, and they have all their support documents. and they index all of them in a bunch of different ways. But essentially, what they do is they take all these documents, break them into chunks, which could be sections or paragraphs, but i.e. pieces where each chunk is really like maybe talking about one thing or focused on one aspect. Then they index each of them as if they were separate documents. And when you type a question, the technology, what it does is it tries to find, in the sense of document similarity, tries to find the chunks that are the closest thing to the question you just asked. Yeah. And so that's a typical search engine thing that we can already do today before generative AI. The new thing is that what they will do is take all of these chunks that are returned by the search engine and use generative AI to do a summarization focused on responding to that question. And so
yeah, that's very powerful. That's very powerful.
Super powerful. And it tends to work really well in a lot of cases. However, and this is the big caveat, and knowing a few of the companies a little more closely, they are still struggling with the hallucination problem, with the notion that it does a summarization of these documents, but it's still this trained text model. So it could still make up facts. It could still, like say things that are wrong. And so if you are using it for your own internal enterprise search, then you can do it, take all of this with a grain of salt and, use it for what it is. You still have to fact check. The reason that you haven't seen a lot of sophisticated customer service bots out there right now, like why they don't exist everywhere, despite the enormous amount of investment in them, is that these companies they're still struggling with that. It's not okay. And even if you're giving a false information 1% of the time, that is way too high. So folks are still trying to figure out how to put guardrails on it so that false facts do not leak through and that there's, relevance. And then there's a bunch of other things too, because you don't want, a customer service bot for, say, a parts supplier to start giving relationship advice to your customers, which is almost kind of hard to stop without like specific guardrails. So there's this notion of like being able to keep it focused on the task at hand, and the notion of fidelity to the actual original corpus is still, those are still challenges in using it as a customer service bot.
Yeah, and we're seeing this in some applications in real estate. Lundy.io, which has built a voice interface for doing MLS searches, is starting to use, I believe, some of that kind of technology, because you can ask it questions like, hey, I'm looking for homes that have a big backyard because I have I have pets and I want them to have room to roam, and I'm also looking for a house that's been recently updated, and it will use that to actually look through all the text descriptions in the MLS and look at the lot size and look all that to bring back and say, hey, here are 14 or 15 homes that have those kinds of features that would be maybe a little challenging to search for in the MLS, except with a very carefully constructed search. And even in some cases, you can't do it because the thing they're looking for is in the text description. It's not in a dedicated field like we're used to searching for. So I think we're going to see that impact of that retrieval assisted generation type technology in real estate search. And because that's it's a fairly uniform data set, it's not the World Wide Web, it's property data. I think there's good applications there. So great information, Kurt, on that particular technology. We did in the chapter put in an example of video generative AI. And I did this myself in about 15 minutes and went and used the HeyGen software to do this. And it was really neat. I pre-recorded a video of myself, uploaded it into HeyGen, a kind of a test video, and then I gave it a script and I said, make me say what's in this script. And so if you scan that QR code, it'll take you to the HeyGen of a video, of an AI generated video of me, speaking the script, which was indicative of like the flexibility of this. I could literally use myself as a puppet to say just about anything. So
I'll point out that this is of value, and you'll notice that's actually not technically generative AI in the same way that ChatGPT is.
No.
What it's doing is it's constrained by your words, and it's generating, but it's generating approximations.
Yeah.
It's guesses. They're not predictions about the future. And that
Yeah.
makes them a lot safer than asking it like factual questions.
Yeah. This, you're in control of what's being said. It's just creating the output using
Exactly. And
the
it's
generative
constrained by
technology.
the parameters of of visuals of you. So this is an example of it being safe because you're not asking it to make decisions for you. You're just saying, approximate this for me. Do the best job you can to approximate. And if you're in that kind of situation, things are going to be a lot more certain. Yeah, it might have a little jerky video, or it might not, do some weirdness to his face, but that's much safer, like more predictable, something you can rely on, which
Yeah.
is really kind of the guess is that you need to, if you're going to pick a skill, you need to figure out when you can rely on it and when you need to fact check rigorously.
Yeah, that's it. Good. So that's a good segue over to limitations. I think in the chapter you did a nice job, Kurt, of helping us summarize what are some of the limitations. Why don't you quickly talk us through these, and let's just want to make sure the audience understands, like, these are some things that are known challenges to this kind of technology.
Okay, first was the one I mentioned, are hallucinations. Really,
Yeah.
it's them just remember, these systems, especially the chat systems, they are not there to tell you the truth. They are really pretty much designed to tell you something that is plausible. Whether it's correct or not, it's going to sound correct. And so, but they can still get it wrong. And so you can't take it at face value. And so second is the responses are unexplainable. They are essentially, they can't tell you why
Why?
they said
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And that makes them even harder to scrutinize, because since they're not explaining it, one of the dangers is the expense in figuring out. So if it gives you a bunch of information with a lot of facts, then you might end up where you have to spend a lot more time fact checking and making sure it's right. And the more subtle the mistake, the more time it's going to take.
Yeah,
So
and I would say my big warning on this one is property descriptions. People want to throw property descriptions at this thing, and a lot of times those property descriptions are not accurate. So you really have to read them and do that fact checking, because Kurt's absolutely correct.
And so that's the problem, is if it's slightly wrong, it's subtly wrong, that's when it's hard to detect. And if it's more of, if it's something that's not factual or doesn't have like legal or financial ramifications, not a big deal. But if it says that it has a backyard and it says it doesn't have a backyard and it doesn't actually have a backyard, then that matters.
Yeah,
So
it does.
and it's so you have to anyway, unexplainable. You're not going to get an explanation of why. That may be coming, but that's math, and that's going to take time. Stale information. These models are trained on a periodic basis. The latest OpenAI chat model only goes up to April of 2023. So anything after that, it probably doesn't know. This search engine thing, this RAG thing I was talking about earlier, is a way to get past that, but it has its own limitations. Expensive and opaque. This is the sense that using these things can be very, very expensive. Most of these companies providing these services are doing it at operational losses right now. There's very, very little profit being made. Unless you're making compute hardware or selling electricity, you're probably not making money off of AI today. And so you understand that if you get into this and you depend on it, you need to gauge your costs. And the fact that I said opaque, because you may not have it may be doing something you don't want, but you don't get to change it. There are services that can let you fine tune, but then that's the trade-off. You can get much more expensive if you need to start tweaking these things. So
I think the warning there is that if you become reliant on a service that's using a lot of this AI, generative AI capability, that we expect these companies are going to charge real money for that at some point in the future. So that's a little bit of a warning to say, like, there are certain things that we're early days. Everybody wants to experiment and try it out. These companies are losing money in order to make the technology available. But that it's quite likely that in the future they will charge real money for this, and you'll be paying $50 a month or $100 a month for some AI tool that you use. That seems likely.
So these things are they have no, we'll say no interaction memory, no medium-term memory. There's this notion of a prompt which can recall the current conversation. So if you're going back and forth, it can recall what you're talking about right now. But even if you extensively talked with this chatbot, it's not going to remember what you two talked about last week. It's not going to remember any of the things that you did. So it has this in the moment memory, and it has its training, like all its factual memory that when it was originally trained, like I said, up to April 2023 for the latest GPT-4. But there is no medium-term memory of knowing what you did last month or doing last week, or the context or your preferences or any of that stuff. There are companies trying to build this in, trying to shoehorn it on, but it does not intrinsically exist there. So you can't count on that. And that's just a caveat. Then finally, nothing new. These things make guesses about plausibility. If there's something truly novel, a new pattern, a new dynamic, they're not going to guess it. They're not even going to be aware of it. In fact, they will just completely miss it. And so that could be, something that changes economically or just culturally. If this model is trained, there might be new slang. It's just not going to know the slang because it wasn't trained on it.
Yeah.
And until it gets updated, it simply cannot integrate that new knowledge. So it can't learn, even if you want it to, except insofar as it gets retrained.
Yeah, and I think this is also there's also the plagiarism element, which we're aware of, that a lot of these models, they really want to run on publicly available data, because there's legal questions about oh, well, I combined these 50 different documents, some of which are not in the public domain, in order to produce the answer. And so I think there's real questions about that, the legality, the licensure of that kind of data in these models. So that's really good. We are getting some questions, Kurt. I've got one just come in that I think would be interesting for us to chat about, and then we can, if we've got a few more coming in, we'll take those. And then I see we do have some Q&A happening. So this comes from our LinkedIn Live. This comes from a Remax affiliate. How does one protect themselves from criminals and hackers that are using AI to duplicate your image, your voice, your video? What if somebody just rips off you or your stuff and starts using it to make other things? Any thoughts on that, or is that an area that the industry is trying to address?
Okay, so it is an area that industry is trying to address, and it's still early days. But I will separate this into two separate problems. There's the notions of identity theft and subterfuge of false names, false voices, all the things that happened before about identity theft and impersonation, all those, all of those, the old school, you still got to deal with all of those. And same thing, the internet before AI, showed up, all the ways that people could try to impersonate and try to cheat, all of those are still there. So I won't even address those assuming you're doing all those things, then I want to talk about that. What I will talk about is, what does the AI, how does the generative AI up the game? How does it make that harder? And so how do you deal with this new difficulty? I mean, I was reading an article just a few days ago about a couple that was scammed out of $15,000 because someone had taken a recording of the voice of their son and used it to synthesize his voice and call them and say, "Oh, I need help. I'm in jail. You need to bail me out." And it was a complete scam. There, the kid was camping. So, but the challenge, the new capability there was being able to synthesize this kid's voice more easily from a short recording, which is not entirely different than what Jack was, linked to his video, where it's essentially synthesizing new words based on text and the recording of his voice. So it's exactly the same kind of technology. In this case, they were scammed because, it was provided without warning in a context, the social engineering they were doing to catch them off guard. And so that they were not thinking clearly, because maybe it didn't sound quite right. It wasn't quite his words or quite his tone of voice. And so things could seem, incorrect, like this was not typical, but, they were so panicked, they didn't know what to do. They didn't think. So the one real thing that it's not easy to do, but when there is this kind of challenge, if you're being scammed, you actually have to stop and think. That's the challenge. Remember I said earlier that these systems build plausibility. They do not build truth. And the more plausible it is, the harder it is to detect whether it's true or false. This is the big social challenge that we're all going to have to deal with. And it is not a solved problem.
I think we're going to find ourselves with this kind of ability to impersonate people with, we may have to adopt techniques used by the CIA and the FBI, where it's like, oh, well, give me your challenge word. My word is Everest. What's the response word? Right. Where we're going to have to be really good at sussing out the fake and the artificially generated from the real. And we just, yesterday we had a scam attempt on us to try to get us to pay a new vendor $35,000. And it is the most convincing thing I've ever seen, Kurt, where it came in and it had the emails were very plausible. Like, it was plausible. It's like everything in there sounded very real. My VP of finance emailed me and said, hey, these guys are asking for money. It sounds like we used them for some services. And I said, you know what? I've never heard of them. Let's look at it together. But it's that we're going to have to be on guard because of these new tools, for sure. So
yeah. So so the main thing is, well, if somebody impersonates you to somebody else, then that's much harder because you don't get to control their perception. Governments, the EU is really ahead of the game. China wants to regulate. Even the Biden administration is trying to come up with something to regulate. Some states, California, some other individual countries, Italy, all trying to figure out regulations and crack down. In fact, I'm even going to a workshop next week in Paris on trying to get Europe on board in the world of standard ways to protect AI. And a notion is abuse. How do you stop it from abusing? It is challenging. The governments are going to move slowly. Do not count on them to help you in any kind of timely fashion. The fixes will probably come, but it's not going to be fast. It will be years. So
it's going to take a while. So we're going to have to be smart on our own and figure out how to navigate it. I did have another question come in that I think would be interesting for you to address, which is, one of our team members messaged in and say, so when you're interacting with a chatbot like ChatGPT or Perplexity or any of these, that it's not learning from those interactions, is it, Kurt? I mean, it's just
responding. All right. So it's the worst possible situation. It is not going to learn from those interactions in a way that helps you. Are they recording everything that you type and it responds so they can use it to train future models? Unless there's a specific business arrangement, absolutely they are doing that. So you do not get any anonymity. You do not get any, kind of ephemeral quality to it. So anything you type into these things, assume it is going to be in someone's permanent training archive to train future models. So there are ways where you can access APIs and you have a business account and they aren't going to record it because that's part of the contract. But if anything is free, guaranteed, they are absolutely.
They're going to use it to train the model later, but it's not going to be smarter in the moment for you.
It's certainly not going to learn about you in a way that helps you. There is a notion and there is a movement in a direction. This was something people tried to do 20 years ago, but it failed. Is to have these notions of agents where you're training your own model for yourselves. I feel like there's going to be an age. Right now, these models computationally are too expensive for everybody to have one, but there is a lot of interest and a lot of effort to get the models to be small enough that they can literally run on your laptop or your phone. When that's the case, then there may be the possibility that you will have a little more control. You might be able to train one of these models that is fine-tuned for you. And that the interaction stays on your phone or stays on your laptop. And so that it's not going to some large corporate, data archive. And then in that case, this thing is truly your advocate. But we are a few years before that's true. There are startups trying to make this happen. Then people realize we're going to go in that direction. There's a lot of economic reasons because the cost of computation, once it comes down, which there's a lot of urgency to make that happen, then it will then we'll see this. But again, not for years.
Not for years. And the promise is a personal AI that remembers everything about you and your world and can address things better. But again, expensive and probably years
Yeah,
away.
and it's getting cheaper. And in fact, I'll make a side note that's kind of amusing, is that people talk about the cost of these things, but you can give numbers, and the money that they charge is not really meaningful because they're undercharging. So you don't really know how much it costs. So there was some researchers who decided to measure it in slightly more visceral terms. Is they decided to measure how much water it takes to cool the computers that run these things. The ChatGPT was trained in Iowa, where electricity and cooling are cheap. So it's an Iowan entity. And millions and millions and millions of gallons to train the thing. But to bring it home, an average query to ChatGPT costs about half a liter of water.
In cooling.
So
wow.
So think about that. And so the current GPT model is 175 billion parameters. What this means is that every word or every part of a word that it generates for you costs, because the parameters is as much of the weights in the network. So you can roughly say that's 175 billion floating point operations. So it's like so if you ask it for 1,000 words, you suddenly asked it to do 175 trillion calculations. That's why it's so expensive. The scale is just not meaningful to people. Yeah. But
I don't think we can hold that in our heads, Kurt. That's such a big.
It can't. That's why I say half a liter of water.
Yeah.
Every time you ask a question, that's what you're. So if you're environmentally conscious, then no, that's what you're spending.
Yeah, it's good enough. Well, Kurt, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today and sharing some of your in-depth knowledge of this space. This is part of the value of T360s, that we bring forward experts who are deep in a space, and then we work to apply it into our industry. If you are an industry practitioner, we have lots of things for you. I've got a couple of things for you today. One of them is, if you haven't picked up a copy of the 2024 Spawnable Trends Report, it is still available. We still have copies from our print run that we did. The digital copy is available right away. And if you buy it, you also get a subscription that has all of our past editions and all of our real estate almanacs and other research. It's a great value. It's $250 for the year, and you get everything, including the most recent report and a printed copy. Also today, we do have a giveaway, which is we released the T3 Tech Guide as a limited edition print publication in October of last year. It's at t3trends.com/tech-guide. You can pick up a copy there. The digital version is available at no charge, and it has a great chapter where our team brainstormed the ways in the industry, the different areas in the industry that we think that the generative AI technology is going to have the most impact. And so we identified, I don't know, it's about 70 or 80 different specific things that we felt this technology is either currently being applied to solve or will be applied to solve in technology products. So it's pretty fascinating. There's some hands-on material in this particular guide also about industry technologies that we think practitioners should be aware of. So if you're a broker, an agent, a team leader, pick this up. It's free. It's available now. And just go ahead and get it. So Kurt, again, thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us about this particular topic. You've studied it for a lot longer than most people that are claiming to be experts and actually have a real background in it, and I deeply appreciate that. So from T360, thank you for joining us. Right. And who knows, maybe we do more things in the future.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks so much.